Hello, everyone. This is Dawood from AutoMarketplace, and today we're going to be speaking with Lenny Frias, a longtime TLC licensed driver and native New Yorker. Lenny drove the yellow cab in NYC for about 10 years, starting in 2006 before making the switch over to Uber and Lyft, and also working for other bases. Lenny's father and uncle were also in the industry. In fact, his uncle was a medallion owner at one point, which we'll get into. And so we think Lenny is really well placed to speak about the driver's perspective of working in the TLC industry, from yellow taxi to Uber to livery work. He's done it all. So thanks a lot for joining us today, Lenny. And I'll let you kind of introduce yourself as well, like your background.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So my name is Lenny Frias, and I'm from the Dominican Republic, right? I got into the TLC business because my father and my uncle both used to drive a yellow cab. So my uncle bought a medallion in 1997 because he thought it was going to be good for retirement. So he drove a cab in the night, and my father drove during the day. And then when I was about, I'm gonna say 20 years old, I decided to move out of my house and I needed a full-time job while I went to college. And my dad said, "Why don't you drive a cab?" And I said, I don't know the city. I don't know. I know how to drive. I just don't know the city. And he said, "It's easy. New York, Manhattan is a grid. It's very easy. And the rest of the boroughs, you don't really get too many trips to the outer boroughs unless it's the airports. And that's easy also." And we're talking about 2006. That's when I
Got it.
started driving.
And your dad, just to get a sense of it, when did your dad and your uncle like start in the bit? Like, so he bought the medallion in 97 or around
97.
that.
So
And
my
so,
uncle
yeah.
started driving a yellow cab in 97.
In 97. And so he bought the yellow medallion like basically as soon as he
Off,
started driving.
yeah, because he had a friend that was driving a yellow cab, and his friend told him the business is good, and this is a good opportunity for you to, set in stone your retirement by buying a medallion. So they thought that was the best option at the moment. So he even pitched for my dad to start driving a yellow cab, which he did shortly after.
And so, do you remember? Just because I know people are gonna die for this, like, do you remember the price he paid for it in 1997?
157,000.
Okay, and we'll get into that later. It's crazy that all these years later, it's actually effectively less than that price what it was in 97. So you started driving in 2006, and so describe the yellow cab industry like in 2006. Like, how was it? I take it you were renting from a garage, was it, or you were driving your uncle's medallion? Like, how was it working?
Well, my uncle's medallion was pretty much my uncle in the night and my dad in the day. So there was no room for me to use his cab. So I got the TLC license, and so I wanted to test it out part-time first, doing maybe Fridays, Saturdays. And so I went to a garage, to a regular garage right in Harlem, 126th Street. It was not what I expected. I thought it would be a little easier, but it was more like you had to get there at 4 in the morning before everybody, and you had to give money to the dispatcher. So not to guarantee a car, but to have uh, a good chance at getting a car.
So
And
so the way it worked, and probably a lot of guys who are listening to this are like so the shift was starting, correct me if I'm wrong, the shift started like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m.
5 a.m. So the shifts, day shift 5 to 5, nighttime 5 to 5, which was one of the biggest drawbacks to that industry, and probably why Uber and Lyft uh, was so successful when they came in here.
And so how, and that's actually a really good point because a lot of people forgot like that's how it used to work. Like basically you were an independent operator, but you still had to, you were on like the clock basically. So
Yeah,
so the shift starts at 5 a.m. You got to go there at 4 a.m., which means you're waking up at what time? Like 3
yeah.
a.m. or something?
I'm waking up at 3:30 and driving to the base, to the garage. I'm sorry, uh, looking for parking, and then going to the garage, give the dispatcher $5 or $10 so that he can consider you in getting a car. Now, if you wanted a car like full time, let's say you wanted a car full time, I'm gonna work full time. They will tell you, okay, you have to work 6 days, at least 6 days a week. If you're gonna work less than 6 days, we're not gonna give you a specific car because we want to guarantee that rent money. So that was a drawback for me because at the beginning I wanted to start part-time. I kind of wanted to feel it out. So as a part-time driver, I will get the scraps, your leftovers. Sometimes I will go and not get a car.
Oh, so you would, there were instances where basically like you went there, you paid the dispatcher the tip, you probably got to know the dispatcher over a while, you became like a usual. And then sometimes maybe in the early days, like they're like, listen, maybe tomorrow try, but we just got no cars.
Try the next shift or try tomorrow because there's more drivers than cars.
And how would you describe, so we kind of got into this in another podcast recently, like, would you say the garage you dealt with, like, were they okay? Were they like normally New York aggressive, or were they kind of like, it wasn't the greatest feeling to deal with them?
No, they were New York aggressive. I heard on the podcast that Caroline said that her husband never had a problem with 21st Street, which is in Manhattan, and that's fine. I never went to that garage, so I don't know what that garage was like, but I've been to many other garages in Harlem and in Queens, and it was a New York aggressive, sorry buddy, there's no cars, like, and if most of the cars were dirty, they were not maintained properly, the tires were bald, and if you told them this, they would just shrug it off like, oh, you don't want to drive the car, we'll give it to somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. Next in line. You're one of many. Yeah. You're one of many, buddy. Like next in line kind of thing.
Drivers had no collateral. All the collateral, I mean, not collateral, I'm sorry, leverage. Drivers had no leverage. All the leverage the garages had.
And so you were doing this. So then you started in 2006. Were you doing it for part-time for like basically all the years leading up to you switching to Uber and Lyft, or did you become full-time?
No, I became full-time a month later because I saw how much money I was making part-time. And I said, okay, this is a good.
And what was that like? What was the money back then? Like 2000?
The money,
yeah.
In my pocket, right? After paying the rent of the shift, the gasoline, in my pocket, you could look at anywhere between $200 and $350 in your pocket on a 12-hour shift.
And that's $2,006. So that's like probably the equivalent of like $500 today or something.
Yes, exactly.
And so what was like, so people know, what was like, how much were you paying for the shift like back then?
The shift was $115.
And that was for the day shift?
The day shift. And gasoline was about, I'm going to say, because it was a Crown Vic, I had to put 10, it was 10 miles per gallon vehicle. It was very not fuel efficient. I would say anywhere between $30 and $60, because remember in 2008, I believe, the prices of gasoline shot up to $4 a gallon. So I was putting in $60 a day, a shift in gas, but that I didn't mind. You know why? Because I was making money. At the end of the shift, I was left over with $250, $300, $350.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because I think when a lot of drivers, especially from the medallion industry, are like Uber and Lyft diluted the earnings, destroyed, our livelihoods, I think a lot of people have to contextualize like inflation. And so basically the numbers you're quoting is like, if you're netting, meaning taking home, because there's no like there's no commission that the garage is taking, it's just like the lease basically, is that it's probably you're making the equivalent to $2,024 of $400 to $500 net a day, would you say, like in terms of purchasing power, something like that?
Yes.
And so, okay, so you do Yellow Cab 2006 all the way to 2016. Do I have that right?
2016, and looking back, I should have left in 2014 because that's when I started seeing a decline in my earnings. When Uber and Lyft came in, it took a couple of years for them to actually gain momentum and pretty much lure our passengers to their platform.
How would you it's really funny because people are going to sometimes look back on these videos we do today And because YouTube and the internet wasn't, it was, I mean, it was big in 2010, 14, but it's not as, there wasn't as much content then. If you had to like tell the story of like what happened to the yellow cab industry. So like basically starting in 2006, you're making good money. This garage, I'm sure you got like buddy with the garage guys. You're renting the garage, you're figuring it out. I guess my first question is, why didn't you buy the medallion in like 2010 or 2011?
Because it had gotten to a point where, as an individual driver, you had very little power to buy a medallion. Because when you went to the auction, somebody, a hedge fund, would buy off 10, 20 medallions at a time. They will outbid you. You're just one person. My father, he went to buy a medallion. He wanted to put in a bid at 425,000. Of course, he got outbid.
And what year was that?
That was, I believe it was 2008, because that's when the yellow cab industry was thriving. We were making money. The only reason we didn't make more money is because we was constrained to the rates, because you was dropping off and picking up, dropping off and picking up. Passengers were fighting amongst each other for your cab.
And that's actually another really good point. Like basically your earnings was constrained because you had to go by the taximeter rates. And then if my memory serves me correct, didn't that increase in like 2012 maybe?
They increased it, yes, to I was trying to figure out the year, but it was a big increase when it was 250 a mile and 50 cents a minute. And they also, it used to be 50 cents a minute if you're going less than 12 miles an hour. It used to be 6 miles an hour. So they increased the speed, because what people don't know, as opposed to Uber and Lyft, where they pay you by the minute, because it's easier to calculate, a yellow cab meter only does the minute when you're going below a certain speed. Above that speed, it only does distance.
Oh, okay. That's actually that's really good knowledge.
Yeah. So it's a combination of distance and time. It's not like Uber and Lyft, where it's very easy to calculate your fare, because if it's a 20-minute ride, you get paid for those 20 minutes. If it's 3 miles, you get paid for those 3 miles. In a yellow cab, that same trip, it would depend on the traffic.
And how did, by the way, you're talking about you did the day shift. How did that work? Because I remember historically people complained about that, like just as rush hours beginning, I got to switch. Like, how did that practically work? Like at 4 p.m. or 4:20, did you start heading back to the base? Like, how did that look?
So at around 3 p.m., depending on where exactly your garage was, you had to start making your way to the garage. My garage was in Harlem. So even though this was not legal, I would put off my off-duty lights so people knew I was off duty, but I will ask, are you headed, like, I was going to Harlem, so are you headed uptown? If you're headed uptown, I could pick you up. If not, I cannot, because I have to return the car. But passengers used to hate that, because at that time it was peak. It was 3 p.m., 4 p.m. People are getting out of work. They want to go home. But at the same time, we're going back to the garages. So there's less cabs on the streets.
And I also feel like to make the shift, I feel like that timing to choose the shift change at 5 p.m. is like a really bad time, because that's like at the heart of rush hour. So they probably should have made the shift some at like 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. or something different like that.
But if they did that, who would it benefit? It would benefit
the date.
It would benefit one shift over another. They were trying to make it equally,
That's
so that
fair.
both shifts could make more or less the same amount of money. You don't want to leave the night shift with too many dead hours, and you don't want to leave the day shift with too many dead hours.
Was there any way that it's like the two guys who were like your uncle and your dad were paired up? Was there any way to know the guy who you were paired up with so you could meet him in Manhattan at like 4:55?
Yes. That's what my dad and my uncle used to do. They used to meet in Midtown, and then my dad would take the train home.
Okay, interesting. So, and now we're leading up to kind of 2014 Uber and Lyft, like the disruption and all of that stuff. how would you, I'll ask you a couple of questions, then we'll get to like how you thought about Uber and Lyft originally and then why you made the switch. So you were talking about like in 2006, there was this dynamic, there was like for every one shift, there's probably like 20 people who wanted the shift. So as the years progress, like you probably had an in with the garage guy or like the dispatcher. For the other guys you spoke to, I really want to get to this point. Like, was the stereotype that were they kind of like not customer centric? I'll put it that way. Like, were they kind of abusive to people that were trying to get a shift?
The garages, you mean?
Yeah, like the dispatchers. Like, obviously,
Yeah,
I'm trying to
because
stereotype a whole industry, but I feel like that's an explanation to why people were so quick to leave the Uber and Lyft. Probably, maybe I'm wrong.
no, you're right. Because that's the thing. The garages had all the leverage. So you as a customer, you want to rent a car, but there's a limited amount of cars. And so you really had no say in you had no say because they didn't have enough cars. And if you complain, then they would tell you, go to another garage. And you'll go to another garage and it'll be the same story.
And then if you even wanted to get out of that system and to buy a medallion, you're always priced out, basically.
You were priced out because these people with more money uh would just outbid you, which means the city, but not that the city cared, but the city just wanted to sell the medallion. The city should have made it, if you're not a driver, you shouldn't be
Be
able to
able
buy
to
a
own it.
medallion.
That and
I'm,
I feel like that was a rule once upon a time in the 70s or something. And then there's this whole history to how like corporates, or at the very least, you could say, will like these out of the 13,500 medallions, like 70% have to be owner operated, and then like 30% can be, something
yes,
like that, where it's like the
yes.
owner operator. So, okay, so now how would you describe Uber and Lyft is on the scene? You're driving the yellow cab. Like, what did you first make of Uber and Lyft? And if you had to describe to someone what actually went down on the street, what happened like with drivers, like how would you frame that? Like, how would you describe it?
It was a slow death. It didn't happen from one day to another. We I started seeing the Uber cars, right? I started noticing the plates. I remember like it was yesterday, T65, T66. And I'm like, what are these black Camrys all over Manhattan? What is going on? And it's like, you don't pay mind to it because you're still busy, you're still making money. So, okay, you know, we're not going to think anything of it. And anyways, the city has our back, right? This car has a yellow cab has a medallion, for God's sake. Like, the city has our back. The medallion costs too much money for them to just hand over the business to somebody else. But the Uber and Lyft quickly gained momentum with, Get, Juno, the other companies also that were in here. And I remember specifically this advertisement. And this is when I knew we were in trouble, unless, the city were intervene. It said Uber is cheaper than a yellow cab. I seen it on the payphones when we used to have payphones. Uber is cheaper than a yellow cab. And I said, we're in trouble because the Uber cars are new cars. The cars are cleaner because the driver is the owner of the car, or the driver takes the car home with them. You're not relying on the garage to clean the cars and maintain them. Now the driver is maintaining them and cleaning them. And historically, any yellow cab that you saw that was clean and well maintained, the driver typically owns it. And when I saw that sign, I said we're in trouble. And in 2014, lo and behold, it started to become harder to get passengers, and it reflected in my income. My income in 2014 was slashed in half. I
It
used to
was
make
okay.
seven.
So like in 2014, let's say 2015 June to 2014 June to 2015 June. Like, what were the take home, like, roughly
The,
speaking?
the take home, remember I used to tell you 250, 300, 130, 150. If you made 200, that was a great day. So we're seeing half.
And were the leasing rates coming down?
No, the leasing rate was the same. So
So
the expenses stayed the same. Leasing and gas was the same, but your income was less.
would you have stayed, and this is for the guy, you know, we know a lot of people in the yellow cab industry right now trying to turn around the industry. And I think one constructive criticism I have for them, not everybody in the industry, is that would you have stayed with the yellow cab if they cut the leasing rates? So although your income was going down, or was it kind of like, I'm going to leave no matter what because the money is with Uber and Lyft?
They would have had to slash the lease too much. They were never gonna do that.
So like you're saying you were paying 115 per 12-hour shift. You're saying if your income's down 50%, minimum they'd have to slash it to like 30% or something, or 40% for you to even consider it.
Yes.
And so when was the moment where you're like, I'm done? Like I'm done with the cab. I'm going to Uber and Lyft. Like when was that moment?
The beginning of 2016. I was a part of a Uber forum, and I noticed how they were making a lot of money, because remember at the beginning with Uber and Lyft, drivers were making a lot of money. They were getting a lot of surge. There was a lot of passengers, and they were making a lot more than us. And so I decided I have to make the switch. So what I
And
did.
how much, like you said, okay, you said for the cab it was like 300 net a day take home, and then it dropped to like 130 net a day take home. So like in 2016 when you joined Uber, what were you making like net a day take home?
How much was I making in the yellow cab?
No, after like you switched to Uber. So
when I
said, yeah,
switched.
exactly.
Now
Like to get a sense of.
It's hard for me to put a number, because I switched over to the for hire vehicle when the party was almost over. So it's hard for me to do a direct comparison, because I didn't switch because of Uber and Lyft. I switched because somebody told me about non-emergency medical transportation. And they told me I could do Uber and Lyft on the side as part of my, repertoire. So I decided, let me rent a car and let me test out the numbers and see if it makes sense. Because as a yellow cab driver, I was averaging about $70,000 a year net before taxes, obviously. And then 2014, that went down to like 45,000. 2015 was not any better. It was like 43, 44,000. But once I switched over, it was a big leap, because now I was able to make not 70,000 for the year. I made 80,000 my first year before taxes, after expenses.
And so it's interesting you mentioned that, like, so who did you rent from and how did that look? Like, were you renting like a wheelchair accessible vehicle or just like a Camry?
No, I rented a 2013 Camry from this guy. It was an individual owner. It wasn't a fleet. It was just an individual. I was paying 450 a month, 450 a week. But interesting. That's when Uber had cut the rates twice, right? So 2016, we were seeing a little bit of a slowdown in terms of rides, because the industry was saturated already. It was already saturated. We were seeing it was reflective on our income. And I told the guy that I was renting from, we're not making much money, right? So I'm not gonna be able to, rent from you any longer. I think it's better for me to own a car. And he told me, well, that's not my problem. And I found it kind of interesting. I'm like, but you as a owner that rents, you should be concerned, because if drivers are not making money, nobody's gonna rent from you.
So his attitude is, that's kind of a weird attitude to have. He said, it's not my problem. So then did you return his car basically?
I did. After 3 months, I returned this car. I bought my own car. I bought 2016 Honda Accord. And so that way I wasn't paying 450 a week. Instead, I was paying 450 a month, plus maintenance and repairs and all the TLC fees. But it was still better than renting at the time.
And so that's it. And we're going to get into that leasing thing because I think a lot of people, sometimes people who read AutoMarketplace know I have a background as a fleet owner, but I also
Mhm.
want like the truth to come out and just, just all the different perspectives. So we're going to double click on this leasing thing, but I do want to conclude this. So as we kind of wrap up talking about the yellow cab and, all of that stuff, would you say today's yellow cab industry has learned the lessons of the past, or do you think it's still other stuff needs to be done still?
I think the yellow cab industry is still stubborn, and they fail to realize that technology moves quickly. And not only technology, they do not, they're so stubborn in their ways, they do not want to see or analyze the industry and what's really going on. Why are passengers ordering Uber and Lyft as opposed to a yellow cab? Why? Even if you tell the passenger that a yellow cab is cheaper, they still rather order a car on their phone for Uber and Lyft.
And by the way,
So
too, and just for the audience, like what Lenny is saying is just in the data. Like 80% of trips now in New York City are Uber and Lyft trips, and so the yellow cab share of all trips is down. So what Lenny is saying is supported also by just the hard data. So Lenny, let's say you inherited, I think you told me that your uncle luckily sold the medallion and got
mhm.
at the right time. So I'm happy to hear that. Let's say you inherited the medallion from your uncle and you're kind of like, oh man, I have this medallion. If you were the head of a garage or you had to give advice to the yellow cab garages or a driver who owns a medallion, what is some advice you would give them? Like, hey, in 2024, this is what you got to come to the table with. Like, this is what you got to do to attract drivers.
To attract drivers, there needs to be money. It's at the end of the day, most drivers, where am I making the most money? I have no loyalty to any part of the industry. I have no problem jumping ship. I will go back to driving yellow if they made more money. If I were to make more money driving a yellow cab today, I will sell this vehicle and go back to driving, even renting a yellow cab. If it meant that I was gonna net more per year, I will go back. But the money is not there. The
And
money
so
is
another way to ask you that question, and a lot of people is like, what would you pay for a taxi? And this is not financial advice, but like if you were, I think your perspective is very relevant because you're in this industry today in 2024. If someone's like, I will name your price, I'll sell you the taxi medallion. And obviously, I'm not saying I'll take it for $1,000, but what do you think is a realistic price that someone like a driver should pay for a taxi medallion today? Or would you consider it even?
we would have to see the numbers. How much a driver is making? Gross. You have to look at the gross numbers. How much are they making? So that way you could determine how much the medallion is worth.
How much are you making right now gross as kind of doing for Uber, Lyft, and other bases right now, like a week, just so people roughly?
The thing is, I'm the thing is I don't want people to confuse what I do with being a strictly Uber driver or Uber and Lyft driver because I work for multiple companies, multiple bases. So at times I could be working for up to 8 bases, which is I have 4 screens in front of me. That just goes to show you how many bases I work for. So I don't like to because to keep it short, I make between 80 to $100,000 a year net after expenses. But this is if I only did Uber and Lyft, I would not be able to make that amount. If instead I would say on an Uber X, it would be a range between I'd say between 40 and 80 because it just depends. The algorithm, there's no proof of it, but the algorithm favors certain drivers over,
And how hard are you working, by the way, that you're working for are you working like 6 days a week?
I work 60 to 65 hours a week,
Wow.
which is
Okay.
the same amount of hours I did in the yellow cab. I used to work 60 hours a week in the yellow cab.
So you're actually, I think the way you're framing it is a really good perspective for people to understand. Is like you're basically making it simple for people to get it. You're like, if there's more than someone like you who's working 60 hours a week can earn more than $100,000, then you're like, okay, that's interesting with a yellow cab medallion. But if you're going to buy a yellow cab medallion and it's the same earnings, you're like, okay, that's not that interesting because I can make the same thing without having to pay $100,000 for the medallion, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You cannot, the way you put a price on a medallion is, can they make more than an Uber driver? Because if they cannot, or for hire vehicle driver, because if they cannot, then what's the point of paying X amount for a medallion?
Got it. So your advice basically is to these yellow cab garages who are trying to turn around the industry is quantify things. Basically show people that, listen, this is how much money you make and this is why the medallion is worth X price, rather than kind of keeping it very generic. Okay, so that's interesting. The other thing I wanted to touch on, so you basically have claim to your own TLC plate, basically, because
Yes,
you
I
bought
got
the
my
Accord before this TLC
yeah,
plate cap and all of this stuff.
2016. Yeah.
Exactly. And now you had mentioned, and a lot of guys are going to be interested in hearing a perspective because you leased first and then you owned your own car.
Yes.
So, okay, so this whole EV thing, and for people who are listening, this probably know the background, but this basically, and you know this, EV plates got reissued. There was a rush. There was like 10,000 plates, and then people basically kind of the target of the justification of why to reinstitute it was these quote unquote predatory leasing companies. And we had them on the podcast as well. Now, I don't want to influence your speaking about it. How would you frame that argument? How do you think about that argument? Like, how would you present it to someone from a driver's perspective about the leasing companies in the TLC industry?
Well, the drivers that are renting, they're mad at the wrong person, at the wrong entity. They're mad at the leasing companies. They're saying, oh, the leasing companies are charging too much, 450, 500 a week. They're not understanding that in order to run that business, it costs a lot of money. So who they should really be mad at is where they're getting their money from. The drivers, right? Where they're getting Uber, Lyft, and whatever other base they work for. Those 450 a week would not be that much of a problem if they were making money. I had to rent last year during the summer. My car was involved in an accident. I had to rent a Camry for 3 months. I rented a Camry. I was paying $450 a week. I was making the same amount of money almost.
And I think and I think the way you framed it is very good. You're basically saying that people are trying to think about like my expenses are too high, so how to reduce my expenses, while you're saying that, well, there's another side to this. It's like I'm actually getting paid too less, that the expense is okay, maybe I can save $50 a week or $100 a week even if I own my own car. So like, for example, you own your own car. So right now, what type of car do you own?
I have a 2023 Honda CR-V hybrid.
Oh, that's a great car. Okay. So
Yes.
so if we had to do a like for like, so every month, how much are you paying for your car, would you say?
$1,000.
Okay, $1,000. And how much is your total insurance cost
4,200 for the year.
for the year?
Liability only.
Liability only. So, okay, so if we just doing the very quick math, would you say, if I'm doing very, very quick math, for the 2023 Honda CR-V hybrid, and probably you're saving a lot of money on gas, you're paying like roughly 400 to 450 a week, including maintenance, including TLC, DMV fees, something like that.
Yes.
Now to
And
pay,
that's what,
yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but that's what a lot of these drivers that rush to get the EV plates, they said, oh, we want to get our own plates because we don't want to rent. We don't want to pay 450, 500 a week. And I was trying to explain to many of them on Facebook and these other social media that it is going to come up to more or less the same, sometimes even more, because as an owner, you are responsible for everything. You are hoping that the car doesn't break down on you. And if it does, you have to either pay it out of pocket. And if it's out of warranty, you have to take it to the dealer. And God knows how long that's going to take. And during that time, you're losing money. You're either gonna have to rent a car or it's gonna come out of your pocket. So the whole argument of owning a car is so much cheaper than renting. Not really.
I think
It's not.
the other point, and we've written about this in articles, is that I definitely can see the perspective of, let's say a guy like you. So you joined Uber before the TLC plate cap, so you managed to get your own TLC plate. I can 100% understand the perspective of a guy, let's say, who joined Uber in 2018, just after the plate cap, and he's like, okay, I'm a full-time driver. This is stupid. Like 6 years in, I have to rent the car. I'm a full-time driver. I think it should be said that, okay, yes, you can buy a wheelchair accessible vehicle and still get a TLC plate, but setting that aside, I think there should, and if because I know people who listen to this podcast might be the regulator, might be other people. I think it's fair to say that there should be some sort of mechanism for someone who's been in this industry. Like you said, one of the major problems with the medallion industry was like, okay, let's say you're sold on the medallion and then your dad's going to the medallion auction and like he can never buy one. So even if he wants to buy one, he can't buy one. There should be, would you agree that maybe the way to make this less bitter and less hostile is like every year the TLC, and maybe you have your own ideas. I'm sorry, I'm going on for so long here, but maybe every year there should be a mechanism where like there should be a waiting list, and like for people who have shown that they've been in this industry for a long time with trips and all of this is tracked, that they can access a TLC plate and limit it to like 500 plates a year. Like, what do you think of that idea? Or you might have your own ideas.
Well, I believe first we need to find out how many plates the industry needs, because this is a real problem. Based on the demand, right? We have too many plates out. Right now, we have 110,000 for hire vehicles. How many for hire vehicles do we need, considering the ridership? I don't think is that difficult to find out, so that a driver can make a decent living. And that's another question. How much should a cab driver make a year? Like, what is a proper number for a cab
What do you think?
driver?
What do you think that number should be?
I think whether it be a yellow cab, green cab, or for hire vehicle, because all three are pretty much the same. Now the high end, the luxury, that's a whole different category. But at least for us, we should be making 50, 60,000 a year, 70,000, between 50 and 70 a year, net before taxes. Working at least 60 hours a week, because that's the thing. This industry, the full-time work week is not 40 hours. It's really 60 hours. So we have to take that also into consideration when people say, oh, no, but what you expect? You don't have a college degree. Why are you trying to make $70,000? Well, we are self-employed. We're working 60 hours a week and we have no benefits. So it kind of averages out.
And you could honestly, you can argue that to live if you wanted to find what middle class is in New York City, you could even argue that number, you're being generous, I think. Like you could argue that number should be 70, 80, 90,000.
Exactly.
And to solve for that. So you're basically saying that the whole TLC plate thing is like, okay, you get it with the rent and everything, but you're saying drivers should be focused more on like earnings, not like they should be focused on expenses, but the real focus should be like, I'm not making enough money, rather than, others like, yeah.
I always bring it back to the yellow cab industry. Most of us rented. Who owned a yellow cab? Even if you wanted to own just the vehicle and not the medallion, you have that option. You can own the vehicle and rent the medallion, right? Which is pretty much like owning a for hire vehicle, but then having to pay an extra $1,000 a week to the medallion owner, right? Not that many drivers did that, right? They had the option, but why did we mostly rent? Because it was cheaper. Because if you did that, then you would have to get another driver, and that's just a whole nother. You had to have at least 2 drivers for one vehicle, because that $1,000 a week of a medallion, is a big expense. But most of us rented. And even though our rent was high, $115 a day, and the night shift was more, depending on the day, we didn't really complain about the rates because we were getting paid sufficient. At the end of the shift, we were making money. If we weren't, then it would have been different. Then we would have shifted our anger towards to the garages and be like, you guys should lower the rent. We're not making money.
And also to that point there, I think the yellow cab industry had a lease cap instituted as well, which could be applied to the black car or FHV industry. So getting on this point where now all these guys bought EVs, the EVs are bought. So like what's bought is bought. What advice do you have to, those guys who have the EVs, all of that stuff? We're actually going to come out with a review very soon on an electric vehicle with our team. Like, what do you think about EVs in New York City, and what's your thinking around that?
I think a lot of people, they think that all these guys rush to get EVs because they wanted EVs. I hear a lot of people talking like, oh, they wanted to save on gas, or no, they did. No, a lot of them didn't get EVs because they wanted EVs. They got EVs because the TLC was issuing TLC plates. If the TLC would not have been issuing those plates, nobody would be interested, because how many of the existing fleet, like myself, are switching to EVs? Why don't I switch to EV? I have the option. I have my own plate. Because it doesn't make sense in New York City now, because EVs are too expensive at the moment and the charging infrastructure is not there. It is unless you have your own house, it's very hard to find somewhere where you can easily charge a vehicle without having to wait a long time. And not to mention the range that these EVs, the range is not enough. Our average, on an average day, I put 200 miles. With an EV, whether it be a Tesla or a Kia, it doesn't matter. You will have to charge once, maybe twice a day. And that is costing you money. The time that you cannot work is costing you money out of your pocket.
And to your point, you have a CRV hybrid, like you said. So like, just so the audience understands, like, how much are you paying for gas with that? Because I think the reason I mentioned that is a lot of time they do this industry analysis where it's like Chevy Suburban versus like a Tesla. But for like for a Honda CRV, like how much are you paying for gas every week?
So I pay half what I used to pay on my Honda Accord. So on my Honda Accord, I used to put $30 a day. On the CRV, I put $15 a day. Now, if it was a smaller vehicle, if it was a Honda Accord hybrid, I probably would be putting $10 a day. So the best option now is really actually in a hybrid. If you want to save money on gas, on that expense, hybrid is the best option. And EV, guys are not buying an EV to save gas, because you also have to sometimes pay to charge. So you're then in the same boat. You're not really, how much are you really saving?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so if someone, because just to be constructive on EVs, let's say you have your own TLC plate. So let's say, in 2030, they want all cars to be EV. Let's see if that holds up. All TLC cars to be EVs in New York City. Let's see if that holds up. Your main concerns with that is that charging infrastructure is not there. Is there any other, like, there's the charging infrastructure concern. For someone like you who's been in this industry so long, you know the street, you know how to work it. Like, what are the other practical concerns?
The durability of the car. We have one of the worst roads in the world, I would say. And these cars, after a certain amount of miles, things start to wear. And, after 100,000 miles in New York City, you start having to change parts. How durable are these EVs? How often do I have to change the tires? How durable is the battery? How long does it last? That's one of my concerns with this hybrid, actually. How long is this battery going to last before I have to change it?
And for people who don't know, because that's a huge expense to change the battery, basically.
Exactly. So if you get into an EV, let's say 5-year loan or 6-year loans, is it going to last 5-6 years without giving you any major issues? Because if it is, then you're saving money up front, but then having to pay 2-3 times at the end of it. if you're trying to make a comparison with renting.
And then, I mean, that's I think you've summarized it perfectly and practically. Just a few more questions before I could talk to you, Lenny, for like hours and hours about this industry. But I would say two more questions I would like to ask, and then add what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain right now the Uber and Lyft wait list and the fears of a lockout? Because I think a lot of people are having a hard time conceptualizing this. Like, how would you frame that? So like right now, according to what I know and what I've spoken to drivers, to even join Uber and Lyft in NYC is like a 4 or 5 month wait list, and people are fearing lockouts. Now, we've written about it. How will you describe that dynamic? Like, what are people fearing, and like, why is there a wait list?
Well, in 2018, we weren't making money. Uber and Lyft drivers were not making money. Statistically, we were making less than minimum wage per hour after expenses. So the TLC wanted to help us. So they came up with the pay formula and put in the utilization rate in there. So, which was, to me, it was a little unfair to Uber and Lyft, because you're pretty much telling Uber and Lyft, if you cannot keep your drivers busy at least 58% of the time, we are going to punish you. And Uber and Lyft can't control how many people use their service. So to me, it's a bit unfair, even though they did flood the market and saturated the market. So it was their own doing, but they put the utilization rate in, and then they found a loophole to not have to pay us more. Because if they fell below, the threshold of 58% back then, they will have to pay us more per hour, right? I mean, per the rates will have to go up. And they didn't want to do that. So they found a loophole, which is locking out drivers. So when it's not busy, they will lock out, they will only keep a certain amount of drivers online. So this is where the whole wait list comes into play. The wait list is to keep the utilization rate at a certain level, try to manipulate that number so that they don't fall below. Because if they fall below, they're gonna have to pay us more. And the last thing Uber and Lyft wants to do is pay us more, because that's money out of their pocket. So in an effort for the TLC to try to help us, what they did is created a whole hostile environment where now we're getting locked out and making a lot less than what we did, which is where we're headed at this moment. You made an article of the utilization rate falling below 50%. And so lockouts, it's pretty inevitable. It's coming unless the TLC stops it somehow.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think the way you framed it is very easily understandable. And for people who don't know, everybody got a taste of lockouts just before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened, and then the lockouts went away. I think there's a few ways. So I think everything you said is completely fair. I think another way to solve for this is that, ultimately Uber and Lyft can also drive up driver earnings by their commission. Like basically the commission they take. Now, this is the argument I would make to people, is that in every other market outside of New York City, Uber pays for commercial insurance. But in New York City, as you know this, Lenny, is that the driver or the fleet is paying for insurance. So there's a very strong argument to be made that why is Uber taking 15-20% from New York City drivers if they're not even paying the commercial liability insurance? But then they'll argue, will the pay formula reflects the increased cost of insurance? And I think one of the articles we wrote was like the pay increase this year was 3.49%. And anybody who's in this industry, that's 3.5% is not reflective of the increased cost of doing business, not by a long shot. So I think that's really well put. And then the last question I'll ask you before we conclude is, what are your thoughts on self-driving? Because I know Tesla's announced that they're going to do robotaxis or announce something with robotaxis. Waymo's doing stuff. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Never underestimate anything that's coming, because what we did as yellow cab drivers, we underestimated the power of Uber and Lyft. We thought we had our own little monopoly and that nobody was going to disrupt us. And medallion owners also thought the same thing, because my uncle thought the same thing. My uncle, I asked him, "Are you afraid of Uber and Lyft?" And he said, "No." He said, "I am not afraid. I paid too much money for this medallion. They're not gonna let that happen." They, as in the city. And lo and behold, they took over.
Yeah, so
And
no,
then
I think that's where it's so hard to predict the future, especially with technology. But you're saying don't underestimate anything. That's the one lesson
don't
that from the
you do
medallion.
not underestimate the driverless cars, because the only one that could stop it is the city. Now you cannot put all your trust in them to do something, right? I've seen those cars in action. I went to Phoenix, Arizona, and I seen the Waymo driverless cars, the Jaguars, and they are impressive. They are impressively scary. And I know New York City is not Arizona, it's not Phoenix, but they, the technology on those cars are very impressive. But I also, on one side, I say, okay, we have the TLC, maybe they're, put some regulations in, maybe the city will put in some regulations. And if not, do companies really want to invest so much money in these driverless cars? Because they're not cheap. At the moment, we bear all the costs. Uber and Lyft don't have to worry about that because the driver bears all the costs of operating. So those are questions that we don't know the answer to. And hopefully it doesn't, bite us in the behind like Uber and Lyft did back in 2013, 2014.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fairly and very well put. And Lenny, hopefully we'll have you on again. There's always stuff going on in this industry. It's always dynamic. So really appreciate your time. And for people who want to reach out to Lenny, we're going to upload this video so you can comment, and then I'll pass it along to Lenny, or I'll flag it to him that, hey, someone wants to reach out to you. So Lenny, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.